And I actually made a title for this video. It's called Understanding God's Universal Plan Through Unconditional Love as a Unlimited Source. Okay, we're going to talk about understanding first. Understanding, we must understand who God is and what God is, and not only what He plans to do. People put so much emphasis on who God plans to torture or who God plans to bless, and they put no emphasis on understanding who God is. God's truth isn't about who He plans to save and who He plans to torture, because God isn't only limited to humans. We think God's plans only revolve around us when it doesn't. God's plans are universal. The animals, the plants, the soil, the air, the atmosphere, this whole entire planet has to and will be saved. But it doesn't stop there. This is a whole galaxy. The whole galaxy will open up for us to experience. I said that wrong, but this whole galaxy will open up for us to experience. And then once we are able to comprehend that, the galaxy, then the universe will be our home. We are not made to only habit the earth. Our limited minds think so. I meant to say our. Our limited minds think so. We are not only made to inhabit earth. Our home is the universe. The earth is just a little piece of the universe, the very beginning, because it goes up. But we are not made to only inhabit earth. Our limited minds think so. We are made to inhabit the universe. God isn't limited to only earth. The universe benefits also from God, and He is universally recognized as God. The universe understands who He is. We just don't. The universe revolves around God. We just don't understand that God is a universal God, not only for earth to experience, but the universe benefits from God also. He is universally recognized as God, and we have to understand this first and foremost, how universal God is. All right. The second, universal, what I just was talking about, the universe. Okay, as I spoke earlier, God's love, power, energy, it cannot be confined only to earth. It's uncontrollable. His presence is not only felt on earth, it is known throughout the universe. Everything comes from Him. We have to learn what comes from Him and what comes because of Him. The universe and the planets all come from God. The galaxy, the animals, humanity, even this atmosphere is all because of God. These are all God's invention. But these are all God's inventions. Things that God create. What comes from Him, what comes from God is always God-like. It has the ability to offer God's presence in a God-like nature that's always divine in nature. And what is divine in nature, it is unlimited, and it's not controlled by man. It's not controlled by humanity. God is not controlled by humanity, because God isn't only a human God. God is a universal God. God is the God of everything, and we only confine Him to us when He was never supposed to be confined. Okay, what we'll know what came from God, because it will be divine like in nature. What comes from God is always unlimited in nature, and it benefits much more than itself. So what comes from God will not only benefit us, but it will benefit the universe. That's how you'll be able to determine what comes from God and what is God like. It will have a universal nature. What we think only about earth, it's just a grass reality of who God truly is. Earth is only a glimpse of what God's presence is. And we have to understand that it's universal. It's universal. It's not limited to earth. It's universal. Okay, then we're going to talk about things that come from God and things that become because there is a God. You have to understand these two things. There are things that come from God, and there are things that come because there is a God. We talked about what comes from God because it is God-like. It has a divine nature. We have things that are made because of God, like religion. Religion doesn't come from God, and it's not God-like. It's not for everyone and everything. That's how you know for a fact it's not God-like, because it doesn't involve everyone and everything. Religion came because of God, and people wanted to understand God through religion. That's why religion came. It came because there was a God, and they used religion to try to understand who God was. But it didn't come particularly from God himself. It came because he is a God, and he is the ultimate God. That's why there are so many religions. They all come because of God, and because God is unlimited. It's an unlimited amount of religions. Religions are invented daily because it's a limited God. Whatever your mind can create and think of, I mean, it's unlimited. God wants us to have an unlimited thinking of who he is. So you can attach God to just about anything, because God is in anything and everything. You should be able to see God through everything, not just you, not just your religion. You should be able to see God through everything, the good and the bad. Some religions are not perfect, and some people are not perfect, but you still got to be able to see the God in that. You got to be able to see the God in that. And that's why there are so many religions. They all come because God is unlimited. All these concepts are trying to understand God when he is all of them combined. Think universally. He can't be centered to one thing, one idea. Include everything and everyone, and you'll see him in it all. That's what we're talking about, universe, okay? Then we're going to talk about the other you, which is unconditional. God's love is truly unconditional. He knows how imperfect this earth is. So all he asks is that we find perfection in him, not religion. God knows what we face as a whole. God knows what we face, not African Americans, not Asians, not white people, not Jews, not Native Americans. God knows what we all have faced throughout the ages. God knows. He's not blind to our suffering. He knows what we have to face, but his plan was never about torture. His plan was never about fear or hell, because fearing God separates us from his unconditional love. When I say unconditional, I mean in spite of everything. Our goal in humanity was never about separation from one another through religion. You separate yourself from humanity when you classify yourself as more righteous than others. You separate yourself from humanity when you classify yourself as more righteous than others, because God is the righteous above everyone. You aren't, and we won't be looked at individually. We will be looked at as a whole. And I think that's why people tend to separate themselves from humanity, because they think God looks at us individually, but God looks at us as a whole. If we are able to not only think of ourselves, our religion, our race, our regions, class, or country, then maybe we'll experience God for who he truly is, for everyone to see. Not just you, not just me, but for everyone. Then we're going to talk about unlimited, the last you. And this is so important. This is what I talk about all the time in a lot of my videos. God's being isn't limited. He's not limited to one idea, person, place, building, or religion. When we say things like, God will save us, but not them. God will save me, but not you. God will bless only this building or church, but not others. God will only bless this place, but not the entire earth. God only exists in this religion and not others. Or God will only bless my race and not yours. Those are limitations. Those are limitations. God isn't limited. We limit God in every aspect of the mind when he isn't. And God will never, was never, has ever been limited. Let me say that again. We limit God in every aspect of the mind when he isn't. God will never, was never, has ever been limited. He exists throughout, he has existed throughout time, age, and the universe. His power cannot be controlled by us, and he determines. He, not me or you, God determines everything. We speak for God when we say things like what he'll do and what he won't. That's not up for us to determine. We cannot comprehend who God is. We don't know who God is. So how could we be able to determine what he's going to do? We should never speak for God. And this is my, I've been saying this for a while. We should never speak for God. Jesus never spoke for God. He spoke about God. And that's what I want to emphasize on. It's a lot of people with different channels who decide that they will speak for God. Oh, I'm gonna curse you. I'm gonna torture you. I'm gonna do this to you. God is gonna do this to these select religions, or God is gonna, torture these, Pacific races. Like that, speaking for God. You're not supposed to speak for God. You're supposed to speak about God. You're supposed to get people to understand who God is, not what he's going to do, but who he is. And that's what we're going to talk about. Jesus didn't speak for God. Jesus spoke about God. He spoke about who God was and who God wasn't. He never understood God's timing. And that's one thing I want to emphasize on. Jesus never understood God's timing. To this day, he does not understand his Father's timing. He goes off of his Father's timing. When he speaks, he say, my Father's timing. He never speaks on his accord because he do not know. God's timing is not man's timing. Our timing is not God's timing. When people prophesy and make these certain determinations as if they're speaking for God, they do not understand God's time. Earth's time is not God's time. Okay, Jesus states it constantly throughout the Bible. He knew that loving God consists of truly trusting him. He knew that loving God truly consists of trusting him, believing he is who he is, and believing his timing, his truth. And basically, he loved God for who he was, not for who he planned to bless and who he didn't. Jesus loved God for who he was as a whole. It wasn't about, you're going to torture these people, you're going to make these people suffer, you're going to do this to this planet, you're going to do this to me, and then you're going to leave. Listen, no, Jesus just loved God for who he was. He never emphasized on what he was going to do. He emphasized on who God was. Jesus' love for God was so powerful. And hold up. Jesus' love for God was so powerful, and God's will was his. Oh, okay, I get it. What I say? Okay, Jesus' love was so powerful for God. God's will was his. I wrote this earlier, so I'm kind of like reading it back, trying to flow with what I said. It's kind of crazy because when I wrote it, it's kind of like I was out of my mind, and now I'm like tuning down, trying to understand exactly what I was saying, but I felt like God was trying to get me to understand it. So it's kind of like I'm rereading it again. But Jesus' love for God was so powerful. God's will was his. Jesus' will was not focused. It was God's will. Always God's will over his will. He trusted God so much it was his will, God's will over his. God completely led his life, and he was the perfect example. Jesus was the perfect example for us to follow. God's will was Jesus' will, and his love for God was so powerful that he let God lead his life. And Jesus was the perfect example for us to follow, loving God unconditionally with no limitations. That's what Jesus taught. Loving God unconditionally with no limitation, trusting in who he is, what he is, and that's it. Nothing else. No reasoning for his love. It's just because I love God, just because. And it was just pure faith. Faith was his belief system. Faith was Jesus's belief system. God requires nothing from religion and everything from humanity as a whole. Individually, it's important that you understand this, but as a whole, it's more important that we understand this. It's not only about ourselves. We have to stop only thinking of ourselves when we make statements, and we try to include ourselves into certain groups or religious sets and not include anybody else. That's not God-like. God, God's love, God's being, God's divinity is universal, and we cannot understand that by trying to confine him to our particular ideas or our particular race, our particular country. No, God is unlimited, and the more we can understand that, the more we can understand God. I hope that you guys understood this video. I'll try to make another one tomorrow because it's kind of late here and I don't, want to disturb people. But I hope you guys find joy in this video. I hope you're able to understand it. And I'll try to make another video tomorrow and just get into more of, trying to understand who God is and not what he plans to do. Our focus should be on who God is and not what he plans to do. We will never understand God's plans. We are not made to understand God's plans. We are made to understand who God is. And when we are able to determine who God is, then we'll be able to determine what God's plans really are. Because his plans are for us as a whole, for us as a universe. His plans is to open up himself universally so everyone can experience him. It's not particularly about one thing. It is not particularly about one person or religion. God's love is universal. It's unconditional. It's unlimited. And the more you understand the yous of God, do you understand the yous in you.